Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. There's a nature preserve. It's in Reading, and it's preserving far more than nature. The Gallows Hill Natural Area guards 250-year-old secrets from the Revolutionary War. It's one of the spots where Patriot troops were camping during the winter of 1778 and 79. That's the same time the soldiers were camped at the nearby and much better known Putnam Memorial Park. The difference with this site, well, it hadn't been archaeologically examined, but it has now. And we're going to speak to the woman who led that effort. Dr. Lori Weinstein is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Western Connecticut State University, and she's going to be along in just a moment. This week's trivia question. Your ancestors, and you for that matter, can thank this Connecticut literary giant for knowing how to spell. Who is he? Well, stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. Yale New Haven Hospital was the very first hospital in Connecticut. They opened their doors 200 years ago and later introduced the entire country to the use of penicillin and chemotherapy. Today, some of the brightest minds in medicine choose to work there, and it's the primary teaching hospital for the prestigious Yale School of Medicine. For more information, log on to ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. In one of our past episodes, we took a detailed, deep dive look at the Valley Forge of Connecticut, as it's known, Reading's Putnam Park. Now, Putnam Park just happens to be Connecticut's first state park, and it was once the site of a major encampment of Revolutionary War soldiers during the winter of 1778 to 79. Now, those soldiers served for very low pay, and they had precious few provisions and supplies, including even shoes for their cold feet during that winter. Now, we know a lot about their encampment thanks in large part to a gentleman named Dan Cruson. He was one of the giants in local history in Western Connecticut until he passed away in 2021. Well, Dan had spent considerable time in archaeological digs at Putnam Park, and he uncovered artifacts and historical evidence related to the more than 2,000 Patriot soldiers who spent that winter in Reading. Now, what some people don't know is that Putnam Park was not the only location in Reading where the soldiers camped. It's just the best known one. There were two others. Now, Dan Cruson had pinpointed their locations in a map that he published in a book that he prepared on the encampments, and one of those two is near the West Reading train station. The other is in between the train station and Putnam Park, geographically speaking, on land now set aside as the Gallows Hill Natural Area. Now, it's called Gallows Hill because one of the soldiers camping that winter in Reading was hanged where the woods are now for desertion, and the second soldier, well, he was executed by a firing squad. In both cases, their bodies were laid in open coffins, and the remaining soldiers were forced to march by and look at their remains as a deterrent to any others who might be thinking of deserting. Well, up until about 20 years ago, not too much was known about the Gallows Hill site. No archaeological work formally had been done on this middle site. Well, enter Dr. Lori Weinstein, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Western Connecticut State University in Danbury. Dr. Weinstein, a lot has been made of Putnam Park, and I think what a lot of people don't understand in the context of the winter that occurred there with the troops. We've talked about it before on this podcast that there were actually 3 encampments, but we haven't spent a lot of time on the other 2. One was by the West Reading train station, and the significance of what we're going to be talking about here today is the so-called middle encampment in between the train station and Putnam Park, and that's where you have been focused. Tell me, why are you focused on that one?
Well, we were asked by the late Dan Cruson to look into this because not much was known, and they were very concerned about protecting the site. When I first walked the ground with a few students back in probably 2004, 2005, I saw at least 19 features. These are above ground remains of something that was there, human made, and not just rock walls. So I was very concerned about saving this site. but I wasn't quite sure. I'd never done a historic archaeology project like this, certainly didn't have much background in the Revolutionary War. So I, started planning with the town of Reading because they co-owned the land, and also with the Nature Conservancy, they also owned it, to figure out a strategy. And we came up with a field school plan. And the first year in 2007, it was to basically take our students out, make them walk the whole property, and do a survey, a pedestrian survey, and plot where all the above ground features were. Well, suddenly 19 features morphed into probably over 100. So we got really excited by that. We did a little bit of limited testing and excavation because it was a field school and we wanted to teach our kids what to do, but we knew that we had to come back. And in archaeology, you have to make sure that you write up reports after each season about what it is you found, make sure the state archaeologist has this information on board. We went back there in 2009, 2011, and then finished in 2013. And the goal of our work was to make sure that this was nominated as an archaeological preserve, which means if you go on there, that land, and start digging stuff up, you go on with metal detectors, whatever it is you're doing that's not allowed, you could be arrested and fined. So we wanted to make sure we knew the site, that it was indeed part of these encampments that Washington set up. We found artifacts that were indicative of that. So we found chimney backings from setting up a camp. We found musket balls. We found a lot of nails that were from that period. We found rum bottles, what's remains of the rum bottles, because that's what they were drinking. And we found old oxen shoes, because they used oxen to pull the wagons that brought the supplies. So we found a lot of stuff that would indicate, yes, indeed, this is in fact one of the encampments.
Could you give me a sense of how this happens? Because I've never been on an archaeological dig. Do you dig something up every day? Is this maybe once a week, once a month? Are people excited and pouring champagne when you find something? How does this go? Is it kind of matter of fact or exciting?
You have to follow a method. So, when we did the pedestrian survey, everyone was walking like 15 meters apart, 10 meters apart, something like that. We all walked at the same pace. And it's kind of boring work. And then when you set up a grid so you can do testing, or set up a grid so you can do excavation, again, it's very methodical. Everything has to be precise, because once you're at a site and you start digging, you're destroying it. So you've got to make sure you take very careful records, and that those records can be later used by other archaeologists, historians, people who need information, so that they can see, oh yeah, this is what's here, this is what they did. Now, if someone wants to continue the work, then they've got our information. They want to write it up and write a history in their own work, then, they've got the records.
Why do you select certain areas over others to start your digs?
What we had at this Reading encampment was a very steep slope. We had chimney remains that were arranged in lines. And we know from studying historic documents, the information we had about Putnam Park, we knew what kind of huts that they were manufacturing. So we wanted to find out, well, what kind of floor preparation did they do? Because at Putnam Park, they neatened the park to make it a park later on, which was unfortunate because you don't see the actual situation the men were confronted with. We wanted to look at what did they do with their living floors. We know that they were living on a steep slope. We figured out that the huts were jutting out from the steep slope, so we were looking at floor preparation. And it looks like they left major rocks in place. They probably decided, heck, we're going to be here a long time. We'll use the rocks in the huts to just sit on. I mean, these were not very comfortable quarters. And we did a little excavation in some of these chimney remains because we wanted to see if there were some food remains, anything like that. We took samples of all the dirt or some of the dirt. We looked for any kind of food remains to try to figure out what they were eating. We did a particular type of archaeological analysis that enabled us to look at the kinds of foods that they might be eating. What little was available during the wintertime when they were there from the surrounding areas. It came back sort of inconclusive. We did find a lot of animal remains, burned bones. We have burned rock because they were lighting fires to keep warm in these huts. So the chimney remains provided us with, all right, this is where they were living. But a lot of chimney remains aren't there. We know there were probably about 1,000 guys living here. So where did they all live? They couldn't have been all huddled into just a few of these huts that we could actually see, the remains of. So we had to cover quite an area to figure out where some of the other huts were. And we also had diagrams from how Revolutionary War encampments were supposed to have been set up at that time period, Washington's orders. So we looked at those kinds of camps, whether it was Valley Forge or other camps, to see if we could figure out how they did this at our camp. Set us about digging in some other areas where we weren't sure we'd find anything because there was no above ground features. But we found what we think were some of the officers' quarters. We found an area where we think they penned the animals. We never found the latrines or where they were going. They were called the vaults. We thought if we could find those, we'd find a lot of old bottles and junk that was left behind. We never did find that. We also worked with the Yankee coin shooters, who are a metal detecting group who had done some work with Kevin McBride and his Pequot War research. And they are expert metal detectors, so we worked with them, and they found the remains of some of the other huts that we couldn't see above surface because a lot of those rocks were displaced to make stone walls for sheep pasturage. So we used a whole variety of techniques to help us figure out where to dig or not to dig, but just give us an idea of where people were placing their huts and the whole encampment on the landscape.
So it sounds to me like you have probably several dozen artifacts, if not more. And I know in the case of Putnam Park, a lot of the items they found, if not all of them, are on display at the museum there. Where are the items that you found? Did you take them there?
We still have them at Western Connecticut State University. At some point, we're probably going to be working with Putnam Park and the State Historic Preservation Officer to get them over there, and we also have extensive documentation. So we record every artifact we find, we map it. And so we've got all these records that when the artifacts go over, we'll also make copies of all of our records as well.
So what's your next step in this? Are you going to wrap it up and put together a huge report? Have you already done that? What's the next step?
Oh, we've already done that. And it was nominated and turned into an archaeological preserve. We also wrote a book that has our information. The book that I'm now doing, what I want people to know are the stories of some of the common people who were at this encampment. Even if they're not at this particular encampment, what I want people to know is that there were a lot of Native Americans and Black Americans and women who fought in this war. I want to say women fought because they were the ones that were taking care of the army, that were following along and doing the laundry and some of the cooking and all of that. So we're tracing some of those people that were there, and that will be ongoing.
That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. The trails in Gallows Hill Natural Area come with great names like Noose Hill, the Drummer, and the 5th Regiment. Perfect for reminding you of the surroundings you're walking through and what used to be there. Just leave that metal detector and shovel behind or face legal repercussions. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Dr. Lori Weinstein, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at Western Connecticut State University. And the answer to this week's trivia question? Well, the question was, your ancestors and you can thank this Connecticut literary giant for knowing how to spell. Who is he? The answer, of course, is Noah Webster, who was born in West Hartford and lived a good deal of his life in New Haven. Now, you may think that Noah Webster only created the first American dictionary, which would have been a lot on its own, but next week on Amazing Tale CT, you're going to find out much more. In fact, you're going to be blown away by what else this man accomplished during his years on this planet. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe, and please stay healthy.